Welcome. In this tutorial, we're going to pick up where we left off with this scene, and we're going to look at filters, and we're going to look at how to use different filters to achieve different effects. We're not going to go through every single filter that Photoshop has to offer because it just would take forever. But we're going to look at a few, and then you can always enter the filter name and search for filters on Google or whatever and find tutorials on how to use different filters. So the first thing we need to do is we're going to need to figure out which layer we want to work with. Now, I've already got this Gaussian blur filter applied to this head. So I'm going to start by focusing on this head that has the puppet warp on it. And what I'd like to do is you go up to filters, and there are, as I said, a ton of options. You might just kind of scroll through these to see all the different things that you can do. Most of them become apparent very, very quickly in terms of what they what they do. But let's look at what we can. Let's look at some of these different options that we've got. So the noise filters are really useful. Some reduce noise and clean the image up, and noise can be anything from, if it's like an old photograph, there can be like film grain on there, or if it's a more modern image, a digital image, sometimes there's noise, like if you took a picture with your cell phone camera in low light and you zoom in, you might see that it's noisy, right? There's little variations in the color and it looks kind of granulated. And so that's one of the reasons you would do it. Adding noise is so you can make something look, so you can make two images look as though they are the same, right? If you take a really high quality image and try and composite it with a low quality image, the difference in quality is going to be obvious instantaneously. And so sometimes you need to add noise to one image to make it feel more like it's a part of the image that you're compositing it with. And if I crank this up really high, you can kind of see what that add noise does. There's a couple different options. You can make it monochromatic. In this case, it's not monochromatic. And if I zoom in here, you can kind of see what that does, right? If I pull this down a touch, right, it's adding noise, but not quite as much. Usually you don't want to add, unless you're really just trying to create noise, you don't want to add a ton of noise to something, right? You usually just want to add a little bit, and then you can make it feel like it's part of something else. In this case, both of these images don't have much noise in them, so there's no point in using this, but it's a good thing to know, right? You can also change what type of distribution. So if I crank this way up and I switch this, you'll see that it just changes the way it's distributed a bit. And if I go to monochromatic, you'll see that it's just black and white noise versus color noise. So I'm going to go ahead and hit cancel on that, and I'm going to keep this pretty zoomed in. This there's actually filters on this image that applied some of these weird effects originally. And so let's go ahead and just look at a couple other options. So we've talked a bit about blur previously, and there's a lot of options here. So there's these base filters, right, that do different things like, there's motion blur, radial blur, shape blur, smart blur, and surface blur. You can click on each of these and test them out. With radial blur, what this does is as I increase this amount, so I'm going to say spin, and I'll say good quality, I'm going to hit OK. Yeah, so there we go, right? So you can't see what it's doing, but it takes and spins this blur. So let me double click this radial blur and maybe reduce this down to something more manageable. You can see what what these edges mean here is like how many pixels this is getting, right, twisted. So in the center of the image, not much, but as you get further to the edges, more and more blurring happens, right? And when I go this far, there's a lot that's going on. So I'm gonna put this down to like 10 or 11 and hit OK. Right, and you can kind of see what that, how that makes that image look. All right, so I'm going to undo that. I'm I'm going to undo the last set. I'm going to get rid of that filter. Okay, so there's also the Stylize and Pixelate filters oftentimes do some really interesting things. So if I go to Pixelate, some of the options in here are really useful. So there's color halftone, which if I select that, and I'm going to leave all of this in the default setting right now. I'm going to hit OK. And what that does is it makes it look like an old style print, right? Where there's these different circles of different sizes of red, blue, and actually, I don't know if it's CMYK or red, blue, and green in this case. It's probably red, blue, and green in this case. And then those get offset a little bit, and what that does is it allows you to create this image that looks like an old image from a newspaper or a comic book or any of the older printing techniques that had this style of that used this style of printer. If I click on my settings in here, then I can adjust. Oh, this is the blending mode. We'll talk about that in just a second. It's a really cool feature. But what I wanted to do is click on the word color halftone. So I have that radius set to 8. That's the maximum diameter of a circle. I'm just going to go ahead and make this 64, which should be ridiculous, right? But you can see the impact pretty quickly of that change. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to leave this at 8. And then this screen degrees. So there's 4 color channels. You know, you can adjust these and it just makes it look a little bit different. There's not, there's not really a right or wrong there. I've always just left it at the default. I've never found changing it too much made a big difference for the way that I use it. Okay, so let's go ahead and if I make this smaller, if I make it 4 pixels and hit OK, right, I'm going to get a much finer looking thing, but you'll also see that at least at this level of zoom, I have that grid, that screen door grid on there. But you'll notice if I get closer, and then when I get all the way to 100%, which this image is huge, so I'm continuing to migrate closer and closer. Now I'm at basically 100% scale. So you can see that those effects are just really because of the way the image is drawn to the screen, and at certain levels of zoom, there's some digital artifacts that happen, right? So if you see that grid, it probably just means you need to zoom in or zoom out a little bit. So let's look at, I'm going to zoom out a touch. Let's go ahead and click on this little setting option over here. If I click once, it doesn't enter, but if I click twice, I can do this blend. So what this does is it allows me to adjust the way that this filter blends with the original image. Right? So if I just reduce the opacity down, right, if I go all the way down to 0, then I have my original image. What this means is that I don't have to have 100% of this filter effect. I can modify that, right? So now I can add like a little bit of texture using this color halftone, and it makes this almost look like it's printed on canvas or something, right? So I can use, 77%, and I'm going to go ahead and zoom in some as well, right? So you can kind of see that it's a mix of these two, right, of the base image and this other image. Now I can also change my blend mode, and I can use any blend mode that I would use otherwise, right? If I do multiply, right, I'm going to get, if I go all the way to 100%, right, I still see that original image, but then there's all of that color and texture that gets added on top, right? And if I dial it down, obviously it's not quite as strong. So this gives just a lot of power to not only apply a filter, but control how strong of an impact it has on the original image. You can try the other options as well, and you can get some really nice effects, right? I highly suggest that when you're using filters, it's so easy if you just use a base filter without modifying it much at all. Anybody who's ever used Photoshop can just be like, oh, they just applied, they just applied color halftone, right? Whereas if you use multiple filters on the same image, or you're more, if you use more finesse when you're using the filters, you can create something that looks really nice that isn't immediately like, oh, they used that. We're more focused on the quality of the image that you've created. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and cancel that so that color halftone's still on there. The other nice thing about smart filters, which, right, you can, if you just apply a filter to a normal layer, like if I was to apply, say, this color halftone to the background, if I go and just say color halftone, right, once I've done that, right, I don't get the opportunity to adjust it because it's a normal layer, it's not a smart object. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and undo that. But I just want you to note that all of these options are only available if you've converted this layer, your layer that you're working on, to a smart object. Okay, so I have color halftone on there, right? I can turn that off. I can turn it on. Let's go ahead and look at what happens when we apply multiple filters to an object. So first, I'm going to turn color halftone off. I'm going to come up here to filter, and I'm going to go down to Stylize and find edges. Oil paint is probably what they used on this, or they used Liquify, and we'll talk about that in a second. So I'm going to click on Find Edges. Now, when I do find edges, you can see it makes really dramatic changes to the image, right? What it's doing is it's looking for differences in color and then amplifying the heck out of those differences. Finding edges is a pretty common algorithm, like for motion tracking and things like that, because you can compare in video, you can take the previous frame, compare it to the current frame, and use find edges and difference and stuff like that to be able to figure out where objects are and what's a particular object. So if I go ahead and say, okay, well, find edges just has one setting, right? There's not, right, I don't have any options available to adjust, except I can double click over here and I can adjust the intensity with which it's blended, right, with which it has an effect on the layer above it. And I can say, and again, I can adjust the blend mode, right? So if I wanted to do multiply and find edges, right, I could do that to do some, somewhat subtle modifications to this. Now, if I go back and turn on color halftone, what's going to happen is so this is applying puppet warp first, color halftone second, and find edges third, right? So it becomes this stacking. Now, something else you can do is you can actually rearrange the order of this, right? So I could say, oh, I want to find edges first, and then I want to do the color halftone. And you'll see how much that changes the visual look of the image. And so the order in which you stack the different filters makes a difference on the final outcome of the image. So that's something to consider as well. If I pull this color halftone down here again and then open up my find edges, right, all those halftone dots that are here, if I put this back to normal and I increase this to 100%, right, all the edges of these dots are also now being found by the filter, the find edges filter. Right, and I'm going to go ahead and cancel that. I actually kind of like this image. It's a little bit dark, but I'm really liking the way that these two filters are interacting with one another. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at some other filters. I'm going to turn off at least two of those. I'm going to leave Puppet Warp on. And so I'm going to go ahead and go down to, let's go to Liquify. And it says Liquify is capable of utilizing the graphics processor on RGB files, blah, 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 blah. Oh, okay. So apparently I'm in a color mode that is not RGB, so I'm going to hit OK. This means that this is probably going to go pretty slowly. And I have no idea. I think I have the wrong thing selected. Let's go ahead and cancel this. Yes, so I accidentally selected this Smart Filters thing, which we're going to talk about in a second. What I want to select is layer 1. And the other thing I want to make sure of, so I got that alert that this is not RGB. So how do I change that? How do I make that happen? What you can do is you go down to Mode, and right, you select one of these options. Now you'll see this is an RGB color. What likely happened is because I was on this Smart Filters object, right? This is actually a mask, and we'll talk about this in just a second. So this mask is actually grayscale, and so that was the issue. And I don't know if there's a good way to highlight that it's in grayscale and let you know that, but it's a grayscale image. So this was not going to work, but this should hopefully work better. Let's go ahead and see if we go to Filter and we go down to Liquify. We did not get that issue, and now I can actually see the image. Now, Liquify allows you to use a brush and a bunch of other tools, and I don't want this tutorial to be too long. And there's an amazing amount of stuff you can do, but basically you can click and drag and very subtly manipulate the position of objects on there, right? And so I have this higher pressure, there's the density, the rate. Do I want to pin the edges? There's a lot of stuff. There's face-aware Liquify. Right now it's not detecting anything because there's just too much noise on the surface. If I could do that, it would work a little better. This is another tool that when people are manipulating images for like of models and things, this is another tool that people frequently use to manipulate the shapes of people's body, right? Because it allows you to just kind of come in and really gently, like if I want to give this guy larger earlobes, right? Now I'm going a little bit crazy on it, and that's going to probably be noticeable, but right, I can go ahead and I can make his ears a little pointier. And if I pull this up a little bit, it might work a bit better. I might want my brush to be, whoa, that's a lot bigger, right? If I was to do that, right, I'm going to smear his whole face. But Liquify is a really interesting tool, and if I reduce the pressure down, right, I'm going to pull it, but not quite as massively as I would have otherwise, right? So when I have a big brush like this, you can see that I can make much more even changes to his appearance. And so this is a really nice tool that allows a lot of control, and there's more to it than I can possibly go through right now. There are a variety of tools here. It's something I think that you should play with, and there are definitely devoted tutorials to using just this tool and how to do it to do all sorts of different effects. So this is more of a general filters tutorial, and this is something where you can find things to go on and learn more about. But I'm going to say, okay, I'm done, and I'm going to hit OK. Right, and you'll see that it updates those changes. Now, one of the things that you can do with Smart Filters is we can mask it, right? So we can actually select this layer, this mask, and we can make it so these filters are only being applied to part of the image. Now what I'm going to do first is I'm going to turn on all of my other layers, right? And you can see how the Liquify has actually stretched this out and made those those dots a little bit bigger. But so, and if I wanted that not to happen, what I'd have to do is actually take my color halftone, right, and bring it up so it's above the Liquify layer. Right, and then it will blend a little differently, but what I might want to do is double click on this, and if I want it to be darker again, but with that even color halftone, if I just change this to multiply and then reduce that intensity down just a bit so it's a little bit brighter and hit OK, and then maybe with find edges, okay, so find edges, right, it's basically giving me a warning saying like, hey, you're adjusting this, but we're not going to do anything else. If I change this multiply to normal and then reduce this down some and hit OK, everything else should be applied. Right, now the face is a little bit brighter, and maybe now with this color halftone, I could actually go back in and increase my right? Increase my opacity a bit so it just darkens up a touch. Okay, so I'm kind of happy with that. I'd like actually the dark areas to be darker, but I'm not going to worry about it right now because I want this tutorial to end. So the last thing I want to show you with filters, and again, there's a ton of options you should go through and just play, is let's select this mask. And then previously when we were working with masks, right, you could use white, any grayscale value to paint on this surface to either apply or not apply filters. What we're going to do this time is I'm going to introduce a tool we haven't looked at yet. And it's under this paint bucket tool. If I click on this, the first option here is the gradient tool. So yours might look like a gradient rather than a paint bucket. But I'm going to use the gradient tool. And what I would like to do with this is first set my gradient and then apply it. And what we're going to do is we're basically going to have it so that at the bottom of the image, there will be no filters, and at the top of the image, the filters will be all the way visible. So what I need to do first is change, currently I'm on this radial filter. What we want to be is on this filter. Mode normal, opacity 100%, that's great. But we've got this option here, which allows us to choose or modify our gradient. And so there's a ton of presets up here. If I go to the basics folder, this is the one we want. We want this just black to white. However, I want to show you how you can, there's also like, all of these beautiful gradients that you can create. The other options that you've got here are these set points. So the bottom ones set the color. So if I wanted to make my own custom gradient, I can come in here and I can, maybe grab purple, right? So now it's going purple to blue. There's this center point in here. And what that does is it allows me to say, oh, I only want it to be purple for a little bit, and then I want it to be blue for much longer, or vice versa. I can do the other. I can get this really close, right? And I have the smoothness set to 100, which is fine. If I adjust the smoothness down to 0, what that should do, well, I thought that was going to do a much harder edge, but for some reason that's not doing it. I'm going to leave smoothness at 100. The other thing that we can do is if I click on these top stops, these are opacity, right? So I can actually make it so if this side is 0% opaque, then it goes from transparent to opaque. And we'll look at some examples for what to do with that in a future tutorial. I'm going to leave this at 100. One other thing you can do is you can add additional stops, right? That's just what they call these. So if I come over here and I add a stop here, right, it's going to grab whatever color was there and it's going to make it so that I can slide between these two other colors. So if I turn this into something really different like green, right, you can see now I've got this purple, green, and then blue gradient. And again, right, I can come in here and make this, I can have it so it has a pretty thin line here. This is how people make like metallic colors and things like that. I don't know if there's iridescent, but I don't know if they have any that are just like gold or silver or things like that. So let's go back to the basics. We're just going to click on this black white and we're going to hit OK. Now once we do that, what we want to do is we have this crosshair and we're just going to click and drag and it's going to create a line, and this line tells us where it's going to go, and it's going to start at black and end at white. Now that means that I'm probably doing this opposite the way I want to. Okay, so you can see what it's doing. It's actually there's this blend between no filter at the bottom and 100% filter at the top. I'm going to go ahead and undo that. And I'm going to go from the top, and instead of going from the top of the image to the bottom, I'm just going to start, I want this transition to be faster. So I'm just going to start at his hairline. I'm going to go to the top of his lip. Right? And so now there is no filter at the top and full filter at the bottom. Right? And with all these filters and the fact that I've warped his face and all these other things, it's kind of silly. But there's other cases where, where you might want to blur something, as we talked about over here. You might want to set a blur on one side, but not have it be blurred all the way across. So let's go ahead and we'll undo that smart filter there, or undo that gradient there, but let's go ahead and go up to this one that has the blur. And let's increase the blur substantially. So I'm going to go ahead and, because I want it to be really blurry and really obvious, I'm going to set it up to say 4.6 pixels. I'm going to hit OK. I'm going to hold down Option. Oops, sorry. I'm going to hold down Command and use my scroll wheel to slide over. You can also just zoom out and zoom back in or whatever. And I'm going to make sure I do have the filter selected because it jumped back to the layer again. So I want to make sure I have this mask selected. I've got my gradient set. And now this time, right, it goes from black to white. And so I want no filter on this side, right? No blur to full blur over here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm actually just going to start here. And, you know, I want full blur to be about there, right? So now I've got this set. So, right, as the face gets further away, it gets blurrier. Now, honestly, this is a little bit like I probably actually want to go a little further, right? Because with just the way the image is, it still looks a little bit, right? He's too blurry compared to the wall, so I'm going to undo that. And I can just, if I undo it and then I just come back over and, you know, stretch this out a little bit further, that might be a little bit better, right? So this is another way that we can really modify and only apply filters in certain parts of the image as we want to. Okay, so this is like a really quick filter primer. Your homework is to just play with these things and filter everything. Just throw as many filters on and see what happens, because there's a ton of different things that can happen. Now, some filters like clouds, they overlay the entire image. So if I go ahead and let's go ahead and create a new layer, because I want to do this and show you what happens, because it's not going to make any sense. It's not something that you apply to an image. It's something that you apply sort of as another layer. So I have a blank empty layer, and I'm just going to go down to render, and I'm going to go to clouds. And when I do that, I get whatever my foreground color is blended with white, right? Or with my background color, right? So in this case, it's pink and white, and it's hideous. So if I undo that and I go to my foreground color, and let's just say I make that white, and then I make the background color by selecting this other square black, right? And now let's go ahead and just say clouds, right? So it creates this black and white image. Now, there's different ways this can be useful. You know, right now it doesn't, you know, it's cloudy. It doesn't make clouds like you would think, but it's basically just a field of noise. And so one thing you could potentially do is rather than have this gradient across here, and maybe I'll zoom in so we can see this a bit better. This is another way where I could have this filter be applied in a really interesting way. If I click on clouds now, right, what's happening, and it's harder to see on this, maybe I should do it with something maybe I should do it with this one, because there's so many effects going on this. Let's zoom out and zoom back in. Okay, so right, so if I go ahead and do clouds on this, right, you can see that there's what it's done, and it's kind of hard to see, but it's everywhere it's dark, right, the filter is working. Everywhere it's light, the filter is not working. So if I was to turn Puppet Warp and Liquify off, and then really make find edges more prominent, oops, by increasing this to 100%, and maybe multiply, or no, just 100% normal. Right, you can kind of see that in some places that's being applied, and in other places it's not. And the same thing goes for this color halftone. You can see it's stronger in certain places and weaker in others. And that's all based on this just being noise, right? Is what that is, what clouds are. So these generate filters generate something. Usually you have like a blank layer that you then generate things on. So so you can actually make a picture frame. Apparently you can do flames and trees and fibers and all sorts of stuff. If I click on fibers, right, it creates these vertical fibery stripes. If I hit OK, right, you can see what this does to the whole image. If I was to then say, right, apply this in some other way, like screen or lighten, or, I can apply a lot of texture to this, right? If I hit overlay and then I reduce my opacity on this layer, right, it's another way you can basically add texture to things. Okay, so that's a general overview. Play and have fun.